There is a house style that once sheltered entire Canadian communities, and today there are only a handful left standing in the whole country. Another one on this list was so extreme that families could eat, sleep, work, and shelter their livestock under one connected roof, barely needing to step foot in the blizzard for months at a time. We are counting down 10 real historic Canadian home designs from coast to coast, and the one that started all for early settlers is coming at the very end, because once you see how people actually survived a Canadian winter in it, on a footprint smaller than most modern living rooms, every modern tiny home on this channel is going to look like a luxury hotel. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and tap that bell because this channel breaks down real historic and alternative housing with no sponsors and no fluff, just the actual research. If you want to see how these forgotten designs compare to what people are building today, this is the place. Now, let's go back in time. In the early 1800s, British settlers arriving in Upper Canada brought a style with them called the regency cottage. These were low, 1.5-story homes, usually built from local fieldstone or brick, with a symmetrical front, a centered doorway, and a wide covered veranda wrapping around at least one side. The veranda was not decorated. It was climate control. It kept direct summer sun off the walls and windows while still letting in light during the darker winter months when the sun sat lower in the sky. What made these cottages disappear was not fire or decay, it was fashion. By the 1870s, high Victorian styles with steep gables and ornate trim became the status symbol of the day, and plain symmetrical cottages started to look old-fashioned. Many were either torn down for something grander or had their verandas stripped off entirely to modernize the look. Surviving examples today are mostly protected as heritage sites in towns like Niagara-on-the-Lake in Perth, Ontario, and very few private owners are allowed to alter them. New England settlers who moved north into Nova Scotia in the 1700s brought a compact, steep roof cottage design built specifically to handle heavy snow load and brutal coastal wind. The roof pitch on these homes is dramatically steeper than what you would see further inland, sometimes over 50 degrees, and the windows are intentionally small to cut down on heat loss through the glass, which was the single weakest point of any wall at the time. The reason you rarely see an original one today is fairly simple. Most were built small, on a single story, with low ceilings that modern buyers find cramped. Rather than preserve the original footprint, most of these homes in coastal Nova Scotia were expanded upward with a full second story or torn down completely for larger builds closer to the water. The few that remain untouched are usually inland, away from the more valuable waterfront lots that got redeveloped first. This one looks unlike almost anything else on this list. Cordwood construction uses short lengths of debarked log, stacked like firewood and set into a mortar mix. So the finished wall is a mosaic of round wood ends held together with mortar joints. It was cheap, it used branches and offcuts that would otherwise be waste, and it gave incredible insulation because of the dead air trapped inside each log segment. Cordwood houses were most common among French Canadian and Northern European settlers in rural Quebec and parts of Ontario in the 1800s, especially in areas with heavy forest cover and limited access to milled lumber. The technique mostly disappeared for two main reasons. Wood shrinks and swells along its grain as humidity changes through the seasons, and over time that movement breaks the mortar seal around each log end, letting air leak straight through the wall. At the same time, once milled dimensional lumber reached rural communities by rail, it was faster and far more consistent to build within hand-cut log ends. Most cordwood homes were abandoned or demolished once families could afford a conventional frame house. A small revival community of cordwood builders still exists today, and in 2026, a professionally built cordwood home runs roughly $180 to $250 per square foot in labor alone. But almost none of the original 19th century examples survive intact. Before Manitoba was even a province, Métis and French Canadian settlers along the Red River built homes using a method called piece-sur-piece, or Red River frame construction. Instead of stacking full logs like a typical log cabin, builders squared off timber and slid horizontal planks into vertical groove posts, similar to how a modern shed panel slides into a track. This made the walls faster to build, easier to repair one plank at a time, and allowed for slightly larger openings for windows than a standard log cabin. This style was tied directly to the fur trade economy and the Red River Metis settlements, and it started disappearing for two reasons at once. First, milled lumber became widely available once railways reached the prairies in the 1880s, which made frame construction faster and cheaper. Second, much of the original Red River settlement land was redeveloped as Winnipeg expanded outward. Today, only a small number of verified Red River frame structures survive, and most of them have been relocated to heritage parks rather than left on their original sites. The best surviving example still standing is Seven Oaks House Museum in Winnipeg, built around 1851 and widely recognized as the oldest standing home in Manitoba. If you have ever seen a photo of a Newfoundland fishing village with rows of colorful, narrow, two-story homes hugging the shoreline, you have seen a Saltbox. The shape is distinct, a steep roof that is longer on the back slope than the front, giving the house an asymmetrical silhouette. This design let fishing families add a lean-to style extension on the back of the house without changing the roofline, which was critical when families grew or when extra storage was needed for gear and dried fish. What makes this one especially fragile historically is Newfoundland's resettlement program in the 1950s and 60s, when the provincial government relocated entire outport communities to larger, centralized towns to cut the cost of providing services like electricity and roads. Thousands of these houses were either abandoned, floated across the water on barges to new locations, or simply left to fall apart in ghost communities that are now only reachable by boat. The Saltbox shape survives mostly in restored tourist villages today, not as an everyday home. In 1875, a wave of Icelandic immigrants settled around Lake Winnipeg in what became known as New Iceland, centered on the town of Gimli, Manitoba. Their early homes combined turf construction techniques brought from Iceland, where wood was scarce, with the abundant timber they found in Manitoba. Some of the earliest homes had turf roofs laid over a timber frame, a technique meant to provide extreme insulation in a climate that was, if anything, colder than the one they had left behind. These houses mostly disappeared through natural material decay. Turf roofing needs constant reapplication as it breaks down, and once settlers had access to milled shingles and standard framing lumber, there was no reason to keep maintaining a turf roof system that required so much upkeep. A few reconstructed examples exist at the New Iceland Heritage Museum in Gimli, but almost none of the true originals survive past the early 1900s. Resource towns across Canada, from coal mining communities in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia to mill towns in British Columbia, were often built entirely by a single company that employed the whole town. These company row houses were simple, identical, narrow structures built quickly and cheaply to house workers and their families, usually owned by the company itself rather than the resident. Rent was frequently deducted straight from a worker's paycheck. The reason so few survive is directly tied to the industry that built them. When a mine or mill closed, the entire economic reason for the town closing with it, and company housing was either demolished, sold off for salvage, or simply abandoned as residents left for work elsewhere. Some of Canada's most complete surviving examples are now protected heritage sites, specifically because they represent a labor and industrial history that mostly vanished along with the industries themselves. The Doukhobor is a pacifist religious group who emigrated from Russia to Canada starting in 1899, built a housing style unlike anything else in North America at the time. Large two-story communal homes designed to shelter an extended family or multiple families under one roof, organized around shared kitchens and communal workspaces. Settlements were first established on the prairies before land oath disputes with the Saskatchewan government pushed many communities to relocate to the Kootenays region of British Columbia between roughly 1908 and 1912. These communal homes fell out of use as the Doukhobor community itself shifted toward individual land ownership through the 20th century, partly due to government pressure and partly due to generational change within the community. Most of the original large communal structures were subdivided, demolished, or replaced with standard single-family homes as that transition took place. A small number are preserved today as museum sites in the Castlegar and Grand Forks areas of British Columbia, including the Doukhobor Discovery Center in Castlegar, which still operates a full-scale replica village featuring the twin communal houses known as a dom. This one is unique to Toronto specifically. As the city industrialized rapidly in the late 1800s, builders needed a way to fit narrow row houses onto small urban lots while still giving each home natural light and a sense of individual identity on the street. The solution was a projecting bay window on the front facade topped with a decorative pointed gable, repeated down entire blocks with slight variations in trim and color. Bay and gable houses were nearly wiped out during Toronto's urban renewal period in the mid-20th century, when large sections of older working-class neighborhoods were demolished for high-rise apartment towers and expressway projects. What saved the surviving examples was a wave of heritage preservation activism in neighborhoods like Cabbagetown and Riverdale starting in the 1970s, which stopped further demolition and got remaining blocks legally protected. It is one of the only styles on this list that came close to extinction and was actually pulled back from the edge. If you have made it this far, you already know this channel does not do filler. So make sure you're subscribed before we get into the one I promised you at the start, because this next design is the reason so many prairie families survived their very first Canadian winter with almost nothing. Before lumber, before rail lines, before almost any infrastructure existed on the Canadian prairies, settlers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba in the late 1800s and early 1900s built homes directly out of the ground beneath them. Using a plow, they cut thick strips of prairie sod, root systems and all, and stacked them like oversized bricks to form walls, sometimes fully above ground, and sometimes dug partially into a hillside for extra insulation. Ukrainian and other Eastern European immigrant families in particular relied on a semi-underground version of this structure, sometimes called a birdie eye, which used the earth itself as insulation on 3 or 4 sides. Life inside one of these homes was harsh in ways that are easy to underestimate today. Roofs leaked mud during spring thaw. Insects and rodents were a constant problem because the walls were, quite literally, still living soil, and light came only from 1 or 2 small windows because larger openings weakened the structural integrity of a sod wall. A typical birdie eye or sod house measured around 12 by 18 feet, roughly 200 to 250 square feet total, and could be built for well under $10 in 1890s materials, mostly just a bought door frame and a stovepipe, since the walls themselves came straight out of the ground for free. And yet these homes worked. Sod offers an insulating value in the range of R10 to R15, which kept interior temperatures far more stable than a thin wood frame wall could manage in minus 40-degree prairie winters, and that is exactly why so many families survived their first several years on the land inside one before ever building anything more permanent. Sod houses disappeared almost entirely by the 1920s and 30s, once rail lines brought in milled lumber, and once the first hard-won harvest gave families the money to build a proper frame house. Almost nothing structural survives today. What we know about them comes mostly from settler diaries, government land records, and a handful of reconstructed examples at open-air museums like the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village in Alberta. For comparison, a modern off-grid tiny home in 2026 averages 250 to 400 square feet and costs somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 Canadian dollars, which puts a settler family's $10 sod house on roughly the same footprint as some of the tiny homes we cover on this channel. It is, without question, the single most disappeared house style in Canadian history, and it is also the reason an enormous number of Canadian families exist at all today. 10 house styles, and almost none of them left standing the way they were originally built. If there is one takeaway from this list, it is that most historic housing in Canada was not lost to some dramatic disaster. It was lost to fashion, to industry collapse, to government policy, and to families simply wanting more space once they could afford it. If you want to see how any of these ideas, thick insulated walls, communal living, climate-specific roof design, are actually making a comeback in modern tiny homes and off-grid builds, subscribe and check the next video, because that is exactly what this channel covers every single week. Thanks for watching all the way through. I will see you in the next one.